Jambo. I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, founder of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and the Children of Kush publications. These two organizations are dedicated to creating a paradigm shift in Black thought. We therefore seek to evolve the thinking of people of African ancestry away from Eurocentric patterns of thought. As I've mentioned on previous occasions, the operations of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center are directed by a number of things. We try to publish a number of articles on issues affecting Black people in the diaspora and on the African continent. Then we try to circulate these articles through the Caribbean and through the wider African diaspora. Then, of course, like what we're doing right now, we do put material in video form on social media. And of course, there are the books that are published by Children of Kush publications. I've told you before, and I will tell you again, about the series which we are currently expanding, which is the Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. There are 6 books so far in that series, and these 6 books are Rebirth of Black Civilization, Making Africa and the Caribbean Great Again. Number 2, The Grand Failure, How Christianity Became a Force for Evil in the World. Number 3, Fortified Chicken Broth for Black Souls. Number 4, Out of Babylon, Why Black People Should Leave Most Churches. Number 5, The Church That Changed Its God, The Rise and Fall of Seventh-day Adventism. And number 6 is God, a Moral Monster. As time progresses and as we do more research, we will be adding to the list in that series. Our topic for today is we're going to be looking at the secular scientific concept of God, and we'll be making some points on that subject in a few moments. Now, before we get into the actual presentation, I'd like to spend a few moments talking about issues which are of interest to people of African ancestry. Now, in previous broadcasts, we talked a little bit about the Wakandan cities that are proposed for the African continent. And we made mention of the fact that to date, there's been no talk about any Wakandan cities in the Caribbean. But of course, we are trying to encourage Caribbean governments to get Caribbean societies as far as possible into the use of technology as a way of improving the standard of living for people here within the Caribbean. And you recall the last idea that I threw out was the idea of Caribbean governments seeking to provide free Wi-Fi services to people in the Caribbean. And the reason for that is this is the information age. And if Caribbean peoples are to stay on the knife edge of the ever-expanding knowledge revolution, it means that we need constant exposure to the world of knowledge. And the internet basically helps people within the Caribbean to stay abreast of what is happening, not just in the world in terms of news, but in terms of technology. And I think this is a very important development, and it is something that Caribbean government should, of course, think in terms of making sure that people within the Caribbean have access to the world of knowledge available on the internet. Now, today we want to look a little bit at what is going on to deepen the ties between people in the diaspora. I'm going to specifically look at what is happening between the Caribbean and the African continent. I know there's quite a bit going on between North America and Africa because there's a lot of travel going on right now between Black Americans and the African continent. Those who are aware of what is happening in Ghana, for example, you would know that Ghana recently had its year of return. And that brought thousands of Black Americans and also Black people from the Caribbean into Ghana for that year of return celebration. But I want to focus on what has been happening here in the Caribbean as we seek to build a bridge between the countries in the Caribbean and countries on the African continent. Now, in November 2018, the governments of Guyana and Ghana signed an air service agreement to pave the way for direct flights between Guyana and Ghana. I've been doing some further checking on this, and to date, I am not aware of any flights that have actually landed in Ghana from Guyana or Ghana to Guyana as direct flights. But we're hopeful that something will come out of that as well. Now, the government of Jamaica has also indicated an interest in direct flights between Jamaica and the African continent. In December 2020, Jamaica welcomed its first non-stop flight from Nigeria, and that was indeed a significant step in terms of building the bridge between Africa and the Caribbean. It should, however, be stated that the flight was a special charter organized by Elizabeth Agbola. Now, Elizabeth Agbola is a British Nigerian, and she is the CEO of Nigerians Travel Too. The flight that took place between Nigeria and Jamaica predominantly represented the efforts that were put in by Miss Elizabeth Agbola. So I think she should be congratulated for the efforts which she took in terms of chartering aircraft. I think it was a Nigerian registered air company, and I think it's called Air Peace. So it was the Air Peace flight that came into Jamaica on the 21st of December 2020. The then senior strategist in the Ministry of Tourism in Jamaica, Delana Seaborite, pointed out that currently it is not financially viable to operate non-stop flights between Jamaica and Africa. And he cited a number of challenges that were being experienced by those who were very interested in establishing these non-stop flights. Some of the challenges listed, he mentioned that there was limited tourist and business traffic between the Caribbean and Africa. He also mentioned the length of the flight, which he said would take about 12 hours. He talked about the high fuel costs and other costs, visa difficulties. And I should say something on the issue of these difficulties. I think not only is the question of visas a problem for people in the Caribbean who may wish to visit Africa, but even if you are on the continent of Africa and you are moving from country to country, the visa regulations can be quite daunting. Now, because of finances and because of the high costs of air traffic, governments in Africa and the Caribbean, we may not be able to implement what we want in the immediate sense, but there are things that could be done. And I think that governments in the Caribbean and governments in Africa should seriously think in terms of their visa regulations and look at how it restricts the movement of not only continental Africans, but also it restricts the movement of Caribbean and other diasporan Africans who visit the continent and who may not just want to visit one country, but may want to visit different countries. The visa requirement sometimes makes it almost impossible to do that. So that's something the heads of governments in both Africa and the Caribbean need to think seriously about, removing these laborsome or cumbersome visa regulations that restrict the travel between the peoples of the two regions. Then, of course, he also mentioned the astronomically high costs of tickets or ticket to fly from Africa to the Caribbean and vice versa, very expensive. And of course, he made mention of the fact that very little marketing has actually been done in the two regions to get people from the two regions interested in visiting each other. Now, Severide also pointed out that at least he did a comparison between what is happening in the Caribbean and what is happening in America. And he said that even in the United States, there are limited nonstop flights between the US and Africa. He was, however, confident that over time, as you get a growing middle class, as the middle class continues to grow and prosper in both regions, that we could see an increase in the amount of travel between the two regions, which would then, of course, help to make flights more viable. When President Nana Akufo-Addo visited Barbados in 2019, a number of issues were discussed, including the possibility of Ghanaian nurses being employed in the health sector in Barbados. And I know that this has been a fruitful plan because at present, we have a number of Ghanaian nurses working in the health sector in Barbados. So kudos to Ms. Motley and President Addo for making that happen. Ms. Motley also disclosed that the government of Barbados would open a small embassy in Accra, Ghana, which would have been a first on the continent. Ms. Motley also addressed the issue of visas, and she announced that Ghanaians visiting Barbados would not require to get a visa, which of course is a very positive development. On the issue of travel between Africa and the Caribbean, Ms. Motley stated, and I quote, she said, with respect to air and maritime transportation between the Caribbean and Africa, it is a crying shame and a scandal that as we go into the third decade of the 21st century, there's no direct scheduled airline between West Africa and the Caribbean, end of quote. A bridge needs to be built between Africa and the Caribbean. That is what both African leaders are saying, that is what Caribbean leaders are saying, but the bridge is proving a little challenging. Now, leaders on both sides of the Atlantic have spoken the right words, but to date, the problems confronting the building of this bridge across the Atlantic has proven to be intractable. Since our ancestors came to the Caribbean and the Americas by means of ships, there were no airplanes flying in the time of the Atlantic slave trade. So ships were used. So I'm just wondering if perhaps we cannot think in terms of resurrecting the idea of maritime travel between the Caribbean and Africa. Now, Prophet Marcus Garvey, one of his visions was to have a fleet of ships which would sail between the diaspora from the Americas into the Caribbean, South America, and of course, into the continent of Africa. And what Prophet Garvey had in mind was the increasing both trade and travel between the diaspora and the continent of Africa. Maybe it is time for governments in the Caribbean and Africa to dust off Garvey's vision and see if this could be at least a first step in helping to bridge that gap that we all agree needs to be bridged so that separated families on both sides of the Atlantic can once again be reunited. If we can't do it by air, we can try doing it by sea. Remember, the longest journey begins with the first step. Where there is no vision, the people will perish. I'm going to take a break at this point. When I return, I'll get into my subject for today, which is the concept of God from a secular and scientific perspective. Welcome back. Let's get straight into the heart of our subject. Now, the story of Galileo Galilei is perhaps one of the best known stories that illustrates the conflict that existed between science and religion down through the centuries. Now, in the story of Galileo being a scientifically minded person as he peered through his telescope, Galileo became convinced that the Earth was actually revolving around the sun along with the other planets. Now, this idea was anathema to the church in the day of Galileo. The church had a completely different perspective, and that perspective was that the Earth was the center of everything and that the sun, the moon, and all the other planets were revolving around the Earth. Now, the church championed the view known as the geocentric view, whereas Galileo, using the scientific methodology available to him in his day, said this was not correct, that actually the Earth and the other planets were rotating around the sun. Now, the church based its understanding of the rotation of the heavenly bodies around the Earth on a Bible story, and that is the story about Joshua, when Joshua was engaged in ethnic cleansing war against the Amalekites. And in order to successfully defeat the Amalekites, Joshua prayed that the sun would stand still to give him enough daylight time to complete his ethnic cleansing war against the Amorites. Now, I will resist the temptation to get into the implications of any heavenly body suddenly stopping just like that. But I just want you to imagine you are in a car, the car is traveling at about 100 miles an hour, and then the car just suddenly stops, just like that. Now, if you are in the front seat of the car and you do not have on your seatbelt, chances are you could be propelled by your motion or your momentum through the windscreen of the car. Now, the Earth circulates or rotates at over, I think they tell me, about 100 miles an hour. So you can imagine what trouble we would experience if the Earth stopped, which is what should have been recorded, that the Earth stood still rather than the sun standing still. Now, of course, this raises a very, very interesting question. Now, an omniscient deity, and we said that one of the characteristics of the God of the Abrahamic faith, which would have been the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is that this being is supposed to be omniscient. In other words, he's supposed to be all-knowing. So my question is, shouldn't an all-knowing deity not have outline to someone who is writing a book that is supposed to have been given, which was being revealed by this same deity, should that deity not make sure that the individual who is writing the book has accurate scientific information? Because after all, the person is not just writing for their time. I mean, if this was what was thought in the day of Joshua, that the earth was the center and everything was rotating around, then that was Joshua could be, or the writer of the book could be excused. But here we're talking about a book that is supposed to come right down to our time, into a more scientific era when we are engaged in space exploration, when we have telescopes and we can see what is going on outside in the solar system. So we know beyond the shadow of a doubt that the earth is rotating around the sun. Now, should not an omniscient being know that? And should the omniscient being not have communicated accurate scientific information to those who are writing in the name of this omniscient being? Just a question I throw out there for your contemplation. Now, the apology of Pope John Paul on October 31, 1992, admitting that Galileo was right and that the church and the Bible were wrong, raises some questions that deserve to be answered by the faithful. Clearly, this illustrates the point that the Bible is not 100% reliable in scientific matters. This also raises the question of biblical inerrancy and the omniscience of the God of the Old Testament. Now, Galileo narrowly escaped being burnt at the stake for challenging the church's view that the sun rotated around the earth. Now, Galileo only challenged one aspect of the church's understanding. But by the time we come to Charles Darwin, we find out that the theory that Charles Darwin advanced, which is the theory of evolution, challenged the entire structure of religion and the concept or the need for a supernatural being who we refer to as God. Now, the theory of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin provides a scientific explanation for the origins of the universe and the origin of life. Evolutionary biology provides an explanation about how the universe began and how life changed over millions of years until the arrival of modern Homo sapien man. This scientific explanation of the origin of the universe and man is the dominant position in academia and even in some religious organizations that have gravitated to a position known as theistic evolution. Evolution, as propounded by most of the scientific community, teaches that approximately 13.8 billion years ago, all matter was compressed into an infinitesimal dot. This dot exploded outward at the speed of light. Our solar system was born, and all of the rest of what we observe as the universe. And it was all done in an instant. The momentum of the Big Bang, as this explosion of the infinitesimal dot was called, hurled worlds into space with such great force that their momentum has not yet dissipated or stopped. The universe is therefore, we are told, constantly in motion and expanding in all directions. As a matter of fact, in recent times, we have been told that the expansion of the universe is not only continuing, but rather than what was expected. Many scientists believed that as time progressed over the centuries and the millions of years since the Big Bang, that the expansion of the universe would actually slow down. But what scientists are now beginning to realize is that rather than slowing down, the acceleration or the movement of the universe is actually speeding up. Homo sapien man is the most recent stage of a life process that began millions of years ago, according to the evolutionary framework. Simple organisms, in their struggle to survive, kept changing or evolving to meet new circumstances. Adaptation and survival of the fittest are key concepts in the evolutionary framework. It is believed that the life form that eventually became modern man started out in the oceans, then gravitated toward the land. Conditions on the land may have contributed to early life forms living in trees like primates do today. Eventually, the ancestor of man left their treetop homes and started the long journey of becoming the masters of the earth. An extinction event which occurred helped to kill off the dinosaurs, which would have favored the further evolution of the human strain. Now, many scientists today believe and teach that this is a reasonable and viable explanation for the existence of the universe, of humanity, and of all life. Let's talk a little bit about the school of theistic evolution. Now, theistic evolution still maintains the God hypothesis, but teaches that God uses the process of evolution to advance his creation. Now, it should be mentioned at this point that the Catholic Church, which is the largest group of in Christianity, the Catholic Church has a very interesting stance on evolution. For example, Pope Pius XII, who would have lived around the time when evolution was becoming popular, hoped that it was just a fad that would go away. Another pope, John Paul II, closer to our time, he seemed a lot more favorable to the whole theory of evolution. It would be remembered, as we said a little earlier, that John Paul II was the man who lifted the charges against Galileo, charges of heresy. Galileo was no longer under the condemnation of the Catholic Church, and John Paul admitted that the church was wrong and that Galileo had been right in his scientific prognostications. So John Paul II seemed more favorably disposed to the whole idea of evolution. And then, of course, the current Pope, Pope Francis, a man known for making some very troublesome statements to the faithful, he has actually made the most sweeping statements in favor of evolution, where he made mention of the fact that the Big Bang Theory does not contradict the book of Genesis. And he also made the amusing statement that God is not a magician with a magic wand. In other words, he was throwing some stones at the creationists who seemed to think that God just spoke and things came in, just like how a magician would bring things into being. Now, theistic evolution has a decent answer to the question of suffering in the world. Now, those of us who follow the debate between creationists and evolutionists would know that one of the big questions that the atheists usually ask is, if there is a God of love, then why is there so much suffering in the world? Now, the theistic evolutionists have a very interesting answer to this question. Theistic evolution teaches that God set up the parameter for evolution to take place, then receded into the background, allowing creation to take place in its own time and according to its own will. Suffering, therefore, comes as a result of the genuine free will of intelligent life forms. So in other words, God set up the process of evolution and then step back, allowing evolution to take whatever form it chose. So any suffering that we see in life does not have to do with man, but it is just how evolution is working itself out in our experience. Another thing that you will always find when you have a debate between someone who is inclined toward evolution or someone who's inclined toward atheism and someone who is a creationist or a theist, a believer in God, is the question of morality. Theists will always argue that if there is no God, then anything and everything is permissible. So they say if there's no God, it makes no sense making choices about right and wrong. Morality becomes a very subjective thing. And because of its subjectivity, then it means that it really does not have a solid foundation. So therefore, theists argue that for there to be concrete morality, there has to be a God who gives these standards to mankind. Now, the atheists and the evolutionary believers, the people who expose the theory of evolution, counter by stating that even without the God of the Bible, ancient societies had their own moral codes. We think in terms of things like the Code of Hammurabi, the Code of Ur-Nammun, the Hittite laws, the Babylonian laws, and of course, in ancient Egypt, you had the 42 negative confessions. And we said in an earlier broadcast that since the Israelites became a great nation in Egypt, and that Moses was schooled in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, it is quite possible that Moses would have known about the 42 negative confessions, and it is quite possible that that may have been the template that Moses used in constructing his 10 Commandment Code. Now, we mentioned in the last broadcast the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dinesh, Sam Harris, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, some of these new atheists, as they are called, have put forward some very interesting counter arguments to the concept that morality requires God. Richard Dawkins, for example, popularized the concept of the selfish gene. And in this concept, Richard Dawkins is basically arguing that altruism is rooted in the quest for genetic survival. In other words, he's talking about survival of the fittest at the genetic level. Christopher Hitchens talks about the principle of reciprocity and quid pro quo, where he says that when one does good deeds, you increase or enhance the chances of good deeds being done in return to you. And this, of course, would favor the survival of the doer of the good deeds. So Christopher Hitchens very often used to talk about the fact that he liked to give blood. And he said that this altruistic act on his part, he hoped it would someday, if he needed blood, that someone would reciprocate and do the same for him. It's all about survival. In many of his debates, Christopher Hitchens would also challenge theists, and he would ask them, is there any action or any deed that a theist could do that atheists could not? And the answer, of course, to that would be no. Any good deed that a theist could do, an atheist could also do. As a matter of fact, atheists very often prove to have the moral high ground on many different arguments between atheists and theists. Then Hitchens would turn the argument around and he would say, well, I can think of many different evil actions that theists perform that he, as an atheist, condemns as immoral. And he would make mention of things like genital mutilation, suicide bombing, genocide, and a whole host of other things that he makes mention of. Then there are other evolutionary theorists who suggest that sexual selection is the basis for altruism and romantic love. In other words, the nicer you are, the more likely you are to find a mate. And this, of course, would help to perpetuate your genetic pool. Now, perhaps the two strongest points in favor of the God hypothesis are the whole idea of the origin of the universe and life specifically, and the origin of morality. The God hypothesis affirms that logic and reason requires us to accept the existence of order and intelligence. What they're basically trying to suggest to us is that the mere fact that there is order and intelligence in creation, that presupposes the existence of an orderly, intelligent creator of the order and intelligence that we see in the creation. In other words, if you have a watch, there should be a watchmaker. Hurricanes are not likely to blow through a parked shop and assemble a stealth fighter jet. This is what creationists and theists refer to as the argument of intelligent design. In the life sciences, our observations over the centuries also support the theist position that animate organisms are derived from other animate organisms. In other words, you don't get life from a rock. In order for there to be life, there must be pre-existing life, and then that life is transmitted from organism to organism. I don't think anyone can argue against the whole idea that as you have the transferring of life, that there's change, there's a certain amount of evolution. That cannot be argued. But the point that the theists try to stick on is the idea that you must have life to transmit to something that is also alive. Animate objects produce other animate objects. Inanimate objects do not produce animate objects. That's a very reasonable argument. Now, how do the evolutionists and the atheists counter this particular argument, the argument of intelligent design? Well, there's a very interesting argument that has been put forward by the camp of the evolutionists, and they put it very, very nicely. They said, God is the most complex organism that we can conceive of. Yet we say that God exists without a cause. Now, if the greatest complexity can exist without a cause, then the lesser complexity, in other words, what we see in the natural world, it is quite probable that that could also exist without a cause, because you have argued that the greatest complexity of all does not have a cause. So if the greatest complexity does not have a cause, lesser complexity can also exist without a cause. That's one argument that is put forward by those of the evolutionary mindset. On the question of the origin of morality, evolutionary theorists contend that philosophy has been grappling with the issue of morality since time immemorial, and that philosophy has given to human societies a lot of guidelines on how to live the good life. So we have philosophy being one line of approach, the selfish gene by Richard Dawkins, reciprocity and quid pro quo, advanced by Christopher Hitchens, sexual selection. These are just some of the sources for morality that are put forward by those from the evolutionary camp. Now, of course, since the existence of God cannot be proven or disproven in a conclusive form, one expects that the debate between the creationists and the evolutionists will continue. The debate between the theists and the atheists will also continue. So what are the main points I've made in this presentation? We started off by talking about the conflict between science and religion, and we said it has a very long history as illustrated by the story of Galileo. We said that many scientists and all atheists explain the origin of the universe and life in evolutionary terms. Some theists have also embraced the evolutionary framework. This school of thought we refer to as theistic evolution. Evolutionary theorists argue that morality can exist without God, without the God hypothesis. And we made mention of things like philosophy, the selfish gene, reciprocity, quid pro quo, and sexual selection, all of these as sources of morality in a universe without God. So what then is the takeaway in light of the objectives of this series? We established in a previous presentation that the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have a tendency to try to monopolize the religious marketplace. They try to attempt to make you believe that their perspective of God is the greatest and the best and the only one that should exist. Now, the critique provided by atheists and others brings into question the idea that the God hypothesis of the Abrahamic faiths is superior to or better than other explanations, namely the African concept of God and the evolutionary framework as put forward by secular scientists. Neither atheists nor theists can prove conclusively the existence or non-existence of God. The question of God exists outside of science, so therefore the evolutionary scientists or atheists cannot conclusively prove that God does not exist. On the other hand, those who believe in the existence of God, they also cannot prove the existence of God. As such, therefore, humility should be our watchword as we contemplate and meditate on the subject of God, the origins of the universe, and the origins of life. Thanks for watching this broadcast. Feel free to like and share this video with your friends and your family and your contacts in the African diaspora and on the continent of Africa. Asante sana na kwaheri, which means thank you very much and goodbye.